The United States has had 44 presidents, 43 different, and each one has had to make an important choice for the United States. Some turn out good, while others turn out to be bad for the United States. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, also known as FDR, had the longest presidency of all the presidents of the United States. FDR also had many important choices to make. One important thing that was questioned throughout his presidency was World War II. During World War II, President FDR had many important decisions to make. While he had to make these difficult decisions, he also had other things going on in his life. Roosevelt's decision to go into World War II was a good decision based on the problems he had faced. FDR's character and personality helped him to become an effective leader during World War II. Although World War II led to many deaths, it had a slightly positive effect on the United States. In regards to the world, FDR's decision was good for the Allied powers, but bad for the Axis powers. FDR was a very smart man and had great leadership qualities. He was born in 1882 in Hyde Park, New York. Roosevelt was married in 1905 to Eleanor Roosevelt, whom was also a distant cousin. FDR's childhood allowed him to grow into his presidential position. Roosevelt grew up as an only child to wealthy parents with private tutors, eventually going to Harvard. He also admired his cousin Theodore Roosevelt, whom had become president in 1900. This admiration of his cousin obviously led him to good places. He first won the election for the New York State Senate in 1910 and was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He also later went on to become the Democratic nominee for Vice President and eventually President of the United States. Even though Franklin D. Roosevelt became president at the depth of the Great Depression, he still helped the American people regain faith in themselves and their country. Eleanor Roosevelt encouraged her husband to appoint more women to federal posts, and he also included more African Americans. Franklin D. Roosevelt had many challenges that he needed to face during his presidency. Right when he was faced with the problem of war, his closest companion, Margaret A. Lehan, also known as Missy, had a crippling stroke due to a nervous breakdown. Lehan died in July 1944. This had brought Roosevelt into a depression, and he isolated himself from others that he needed. Roosevelt soon died in 1945. So he didn't have time after the war to make amends with the Soviet Union. World War II was started in 1939, but the United States did not officially enter the war until 1941. A major question was if Roosevelt had made the right decision to enter into the war. The decision to enter into the war was a good decision considering what had caused Roosevelt to make the decision. Roosevelt's decision to join the war against the Axis powers was a result of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt had requested on December 8, 1941, that Congress declare a state of war against Japan because of the unprovoked and disastrous attack by Japan the day before. Franklin Roosevelt led the United States through World War II. Roosevelt was a great leader throughout the war. FDR was a very intelligent man and had extreme self-confidence. Throughout his education, he had always gotten good grades and excelled in law and politics. Roosevelt had a very important role to his country. His self-confidence helped him in this role. He was so self-confident that the presidency conformed to his vision of who he was as leader of the United States. Roosevelt's intelligence and self-confidence helped him as the President of the United States. The people took to his attributes and liked him as the leader of their country. They re-elected him, and he had the longest presidency. Roosevelt was also very involved with the affairs of his American citizens. Roosevelt's decision to enter into the war as an Allied force had an effect on the United States. It brought the American people together to help for the war and for the soldiers. He also had an effect on Congress. He had used his intelligence to convince Congress to provide more support for Britain. He also was the first and only president to do something other than the traditional two-term presidencies. He had decided he wanted to run for another term in the middle of this world war. He won over Wendell L. Willkie by almost 5 million votes. This shows that the American people liked him even though he decided to join into the war. They had a choice to change the president even though they were in the middle of a war, and it didn't seem like anything was changing. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's qualities won people over on the world scale. He even won over the support of Great Britain. He did this when he passed the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941. He would lend weapons to Great Britain so they could win the war. The major Allied powers in World War II were the United States, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China, while the major Axis powers were Japan, Germany, and Italy. The United States started out as neutral. Roosevelt had pledged that the United States enact a good neighbor policy. This good neighbor policy transformed the Monroe Doctrine into arrangements for mutual action against aggressors. Roosevelt and the United States had wanted to stay out of another war in Europe. This would have worked, but the United States had obviously favored the Allied powers. When France became defeated and Great Britain was under attack in 1940, Roosevelt began to send all available aid besides military aid. Then Japan enacted the attack on Pearl Harbor. Also, German U-boats were attacking and sinking Allied ships and American merchant ships, bringing supplies to the Allied countries. These were what officially brought the United States into the war. Franklin Roosevelt constantly had talks on the radio where he reported on war events and rallied the Americans in support for the war. In 1944, Roosevelt had managed to win yet another term as president of the United States, even though there was a war that not everyone wanted to get into, but he still won 4 terms in office. It shows that Roosevelt had great leadership skills. When Germany was getting ready to admit defeat, Roosevelt met with Churchill and Stalin at the Yalta Conference. Stalin agreed to enter the war against Japan after Germany's surrender. Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill had grown to be known as the Big Three. At the Yalta Conference, the Big Three worked to build a foundation for an international peace organization that became known as the United Nations. In conclusion, Franklin Delano Roosevelt made a good decision to enter into the war, which is now known as World War II. Roosevelt's personality had helped him during his presidency in many ways. His choices to enter the war impacted the United States in a good way. He had brought the people together for the war by using fireside chats on the radio, where he had reported on the events going on in the war. Based on the problems he faced throughout his presidency, like the attack on Pearl Harbor and the German U-boats, deciding to go into the war was the right decision. Even though there were many deaths associated with World War II, it had a slightly positive effect on the United States. Roosevelt had a good relationship with both the American citizens as well as the United States Congress. Roosevelt's choices also had an impact on the international level. It had a good impact for the Allied countries because the United States had eventually joined them. It had a bad impact for the Axis countries because when the United States joined in the war, they were defeated pretty quickly. Nearing the end of the war, Roosevelt had met with Churchill and Stalin at the Yalta Conference. Stalin had agreed to join the war against Japan after Germany's surrender. The Big Three had also started a foundation for an international peace organization. This was not yet finished when FDR had passed away.